for we often spent days, sometimes a week or more, in colorful little out-of-the-way spots in this country, or that one, and during such detours, I curbed my crooked activities. It was not part of my plan to shaft the peasants. But my scam got back on the track in major cities. Before entering such a metropolis, we'd stop and change into our airline uniforms, and, on our arrival at the hotel of my choosing, the scheme would pick up steam and begin operating again. Every 2 weeks, I paid the girls with a counterfeit payroll check, then had them endorse the checks over to me in return for cash. Since I was paying all their expenses, although each thought Pan Am was picking up the tab, most of them purchased money orders and sent them home to their parents or their bank. The girls were entirely guiltless, of course. Not one, during the summer, ever had an inkling she was involved in a criminal venture. Each thought she was legitimately employed by Pan Am. They were completely duped by my con. Mine was an idyllic intrigue, but often hectic and taxing. Riding herd on 8 lovely, vivacious, exuberant, energetic girls is akin to a cowboy riding herd on a bunch of wild steers while mounted on a lame horse. Damn near impossible. I had determined at the outset of the scheme that there would be no personal involvement with any of the girls. But my resolve was endangered a score of times during the course of the summer. Each of them was an outrageous flirt, and I, of course, was a prince of philanderers. And when one of the girls was inclined to make a sexual advance, and each of them did on several occasions, I was hardly prone to fend her off, but I always managed. I did not lead a celibate life during the summer. I had ample opportunities to engage in side liaisons with the girls of whatever localities we were frequenting, and I took advantage of each and every opportunity. Monique was not one of the liaisons. When we visited Paris and I sought her out, she informed me our relationship was finished. I'll still be your friend, Frank, and I hope you'll still help Papa in his business, but I want to settle down and you don't. She said I've met another man, a pilot for Air France, and we're pretty serious about our future. I assured her of my understanding and in fact was somewhat relieved. I also affirmed that her father would continue to get Pan business, although that statement was a lie. I was beginning to feel some guilt concerning my duplicitous use of Papa Lavalier, and opted to release him as a pawn in my scurrilous game. Anyway, he'd already provided me with enough supplies to drain a dozen bank vaults if I used them all. The girls and I ended our tour of Europe in Copenhagen, where I put them on a plane for Arizona. I dispatched them back to the States with their arms laden with roses, and a flowery speech designed to allay any suspicions that might arise in their minds in coming weeks. Keep your uniforms, keep your ID cards, and keep your check stubs. I'd always returned a check stub when I cashed a check. I instructed them, if the company wants the uniforms and IDs returned, you'll be contacted. As far as employment goes, just return to school, because we're not going to hire you on a permanent basis until you graduate. And then you'll be contacted by a company representative. It probably won't be me, because I've been ordered back to flight duty. But I hope you'll all end up as part of my crew again, for I've had a wonderful time with you this summer. I had a wonderful time, all things considered. If the girls put a lot of gray strands in my hair, they also, unwittingly, put a lot of green stuff in my pockets. Something like 5 million. He was president now, and the bank's assets exceeded 10,000 with a counterfeit cashier's check. Then I returned to Cashman's Town, and the next day called at his bank. I wasn't really interested in the money involved in my swindle. Cashman's manner had irked me, and I simply wanted to sting him. I was the picture of the affluent businessman when I entered the bank. Gray 3-piece suit. Alligators, luster shined. Countess Mara tie. A leather briefcase, slim and elegant. Cashman's companion at the airport was one of the junior officers. His desk was neat and tidy. His nameplate sparkled with newness. He obviously was newly promoted. I dropped into the chair in front of his desk. "Yes, sir. Can I help you?" he asked, patently impressed by my dress and bearing. "Yes, you can. As a matter of fact," I said easily. "I'm Robert Lehman from Junction, and I need to cash a check, a rather large one. I've all the proper identification, and you can call my bank for verification. but I don't think that'll be necessary. Cashman knows me, and he'll verify the check. You can call him. No, I'll do it myself since I need to talk to him anyway. Before he could react, I reached over, picked up his telephone, and dialed Cashman's correct extension. Cashman's secretary answered. Yes, Mr. Cashman, please. He isn't. Oh, yes, he mentioned that last week, and it slipped my mind. Well, listen, would you tell him when he returns that Bob Lehman dropped by? And tell him Jean and I are looking forward to seeing him and Mildred in Junction for the hunt. He'll know what I mean. Yes. Thank you. I replaced the telephone and stood up, grimacing. Doesn't look like my day, I said ruefully. I needed the cash too. I can't get to Junction and back in time for this deal. Well, good day, sir. I started to turn, and the young officer stopped me. How big is the check you wanted to cash, mister? Pretty good sized, I said. I need $7,500 and handed it to him. As I figured, he didn't call the bank in Junction. He stood up and turned toward one of the glassed-in offices. Sir, I'll have to have Mr. James, the vice president, okay this, which I'm sure he will. I'll be back in a moment. He walked into James's office and said, as I later learned, exactly what I'd conditioned him to say. Sir, there's a Mr. Lehman here from Junction, and he needs to cash this rather large check. He's a personal friend of Mr. Cashman, and he wanted to see Mr. Cashman. But as you know, Mr. Cashman's in San Francisco. A personal friend of the old man's? Yes, sir. Business and social, I understand. Cash it. We sure as hell don't want to irritate any of the old man's associates. A minute later, the young officer was handing the phony check to a teller. Cash this for the gentleman, please. Lehman, I'm glad I could help you. I wasn't too well pleased with the Pavlov's dog swindle. In fact, I didn't enjoy it at all. I left town that day and several days later stopped in a remote Vermont village to do some meditating. Mine were gloomy cogitations. I was no longer living, I decided. I was merely surviving. I had accumulated a fortune with my nefarious impersonations, swindles, and felonies, but I wasn't enjoying the fruits of my libidinous labors. I concluded it was time to retire, to go to Earth like a fox in a remote and secure lair, where I could relax and commence building a new and crime-free life. I reviewed the places I had been on the atlas of my mind. I was mildly astonished at the extensiveness of my travels, recalling my journeys of the past few years. I had crisscrossed the globe from Singapore to Stockholm, from Tahiti to Trieste, from Baltimore to the Baltics, and to other places I had forgotten I'd visited. But one place I hadn't forgotten, and its name kept popping into my thoughts as I sought a safe haven, Montpellier, France. That was my safe haven, I finally decided, and having made the decision, I didn't give it a second thought. I should have. Chapter 9. Does this tab include the tip? Quantitatively, the vineyards of Pays Languedoc produce more wine than the other 3 great French wine departments combined. Qualitatively, with 1 or 2 exceptions, the wine of Languedoc has all the bouquet, body, and taste of flat root beer. The considerate host serves an ordinary Languedoc wine only with leftover meatloaf, and preferably to guests whom he'd rather not see again. It is, in the main, really bad juice. Fortunately for France, the vintners, grape pickers, bottlers, and the vast majority of the rest of the population consume the bulk of Languedoc's wines. France exports only its great wines from the vineyards of Burgundy, Bordeaux, and Champagne, which are justly famous for quality and excellence. I learned all about viniculture in Montpellier. The first thing I learned was not to drink the local vins de pays. I was probably the only water drinker in town. However, I didn't go to Montpellier for either the wine or the water. I was there to hide. Permanently, I hoped. I had reached the pinnacle of a criminal mountain, and the view wasn't that great. Now, I wanted an honest valley to shelter me in its hollow. I had passed through Montpellier, driving from Marseille to Barcelona, during one of my first bad check forays through Europe. Outside of town, I had parked beneath a huge olive tree and picnicked on cheese, bread, sausages, and soft drinks I'd picked up in the city. Close at hand. Close at hand. Pickers swarmed like ants through a vast grape orchard, and far away the snow-tipped peaks of the Pyrenees glistened in the cold sun. I felt comfortable, at ease, almost happy, as if I were home. In a sense, I was. This part of southern France was my mother's native land. She had been born here, and after she married my father, and following the breakout of guerrilla warfare in Algiers, her parents had returned here with their other children. My maternal grandparents, several uncles and aunts, and a covey of cousins still lived within an hour's drive of the olive tree. I quelled an impulse to turn aside and visit my mother's people, and drove on to Spain. I had never forgotten that tranquil, enjoyable interlude near Montpellier, and when, at the ripe old age of 20, I decided to retire from my life as a counterfeit person, dealing in counterfeit wares, I chose Montpellier as my retreat. I was not happy that I had to return there behind yet another counterfeit identity, but I had no choice. Montpellier, in many ways, was ideal for my purpose. It was not a tourist attraction. It was situated too far inland from the Mediterranean to lure the Riviera set, yet close enough that a seashore outing was available at the end of a short drive. It was large enough, 80,000 population, that an American taking up residence would not excite undue curiosity, yet too small to command a major airport or to entice large hotel operators. There were no Hiltons or Sheratons in Montpellier, and its tiny air facility served only light aircraft. The lack of air service or swank hotels weighed in my favor. There was very little chance of my encountering a pilot, a stewardess, or a hotel employee who might recognize me. I presented myself in Montpellier as Robert Moncho, a successful author and screenwriter from Los Angeles. Successful. In order to explain the sizable account I opened in one of the local banks. At that, I didn't deposit all the monies I took with me to Montpellier. Had I done so, it might have aroused some curiosity as to my actual livelihood. I retained treble the amount in cash, hidden away in my luggage. As a matter of fact, the people of Montpellier were not prone to pry. I was asked only the necessary and perfunctory questions, as I went about the business of becoming an expatriate citizen of the town. I bought a small cottage, a charming and gracious little house with a tiny backyard shielded by a high-board fence where the previous owner had cultivated a minuscule garden. The operator of the store where I bought furnishings for the house lent me the services of his wife, a skilled interior decorator, in selecting the proper furniture and arranging the decor. I fixed up one room as a study and library, reinforcing my image as a writer engaged in research and literary creation. I bought a Renault, one of the more comfortable models, but not luxurious enough to attract attention. Within 2 weeks, I felt at home, secure and content in my new surroundings. And if God had shorted the Mediterranean Languedoc on good grapes, he made up for it in the people. They were a sturdy, amiable, courteous, and gregarious populace in the main, quick to smile and to offer any assistance. The housewives in my neighborhood were always knocking on my door with gifts of pastry, fresh baked bread, or a serving from their dinner pots. My immediate neighbor, Armand Perrigot, was my favorite. He was a huge, gnarled man of 75, and he still worked as an overseer in a vineyard, commuting to and from work on a bicycle. He called the first time bearing 2 bottles of wine, one red and one white. "Most of our wines do not suit American palates," he said in his booming yet gentle voice. "But there are a few good wines in the Languedoc, and these 2 are among them. I am not a taste-even, but having drunk of the good wines, I determined never to sample the others. But the people of Montpellier drank more wine than any other liquid. A lunch or dinner was not served without wine. I have even seen wine consumed at breakfast." From Armand, I learned that God actually had nothing to do with Languedoc's poor record as a producer of quality wines. Nearly 100 years passed, he said. An insect, the phylloxera, had ravaged all the vineyards of France, almost dealing a death blow to the wine industry. I have heard that this pest was brought to France attached to the roots of vines imported from America, said Armand. But I do not know that to be true. However, Armand told me, he did know it to be truth that the great bulk of France's grapevines were of American rootstock, immune to the wine bug, onto which French plants had been grafted, and, he said slyly after I had gained his confidence, Americans and other nationals probably consumed more Languedoc wines than they were aware of. Almost daily, he informed me, tanker trucks filled with the cheap wines of the Languedoc chugged northward to the great wine districts, where their cargoes were blended with the choice wines of Burgundy and Bordeaux. It is called stretching, like adding water to whiskey, said Armand. I do not think it is honest. Montpellier was a good place to learn about wines, he said. We have the Wine University of France right here in our city, he said proudly. You can go there and study. I never visited the university. Since I had no taste for wine, although I drank it on social occasions, I had no yen to acquire a knowledge of wine. I was satisfied with the bits and pieces of information imparted by Armand. He was a good teacher. He never gave tests, and he never graded me. It was difficult for me to stay busy. Loafing is hard work. I spent a lot of time driving around. I would drive to the coast and spend a few days exploring the sand dunes, or I would drive to the Spanish border and spend hours hiking in the foothills of the Pyrenees. Occasionally I visited Armand's vineyard, or the orchard of another wine grower. At the end of the first month, I drove to the small village where my grandparents lived and spent 3 days with them. My grandmother corresponded regularly with my mother, and she was aware of all the happenings at home. I warned them out of her discreetly, for I did not want her to know I had exiled myself from my family. My mother was well, as were my sister and brothers. My father was still courting my mother, which my grandmother found amusing. My mother had apparently told my grandmother that I was hitchhiking around the world, seeking a goal and attempting to decide my future, and I fostered that impression during my visit. I did not tell my grandparents that I was living in Montpellier. I told them I was on my way to Spain with the thought in mind of enrolling in one of the Spanish universities. I visited them a second time during my stay in Montpellier. I told them on that occasion that I hadn't found a Spanish college that challenged me and was returning to Italy to explore the universities there. As I became more satisfied with my life in Montpellier, I actually contemplated resuming my education. Montpellier is the seat of one of France's 20 academic districts, and a small but fine state university was located in the city. I visited the campus and learned that several courses were available to foreigners, although none was taught in English. However, that was no bar to me, since French was a second tongue for me, acquired from my mother. I also started thinking about getting a job or opening some kind of small business, perhaps a stationery store, since I was growing sleek and plump in the idle, luxurious life I was leading. Even Armand remarked on my increasing stoutness. There is not much exercise in writing, Robert, he said, poking me in the stomach. Why don't you come to work for me in the vineyards, and I will make you lean and tough? I declined the offer. Physical labor is not my forte, nor could I force myself to exercise. I was still mulling the thought of registering at the university, and the idea of finding some useful employment when both issues were rendered moot. 4 months after taking up residence in Montpellier, I learned a bitter truth. When the hounds have help, there is no safe place for a fox to hide. I shopped regularly at a small, by American standards, market on the outskirts of Montpellier, a grocery Armand had recommended. I went to the store twice weekly to supply my larder, or whenever I needed something. This occasion was one of my scheduled shopping trips, and the store clerk was sacking my groceries when I remembered I needed milk. I told the boy to set my foodstuffs aside. There were others in line, and strolled to the back of the store for the milk. Returning to the checkout counter, I walked around a shelf of canned goods and saw 4 men at the checkers stand, now devoid of customers and clerk. One had a shotgun, another had what appeared to be a short-barreled machine gun, and the other 2 had pistols. My first thought was that bandits were robbing the store, and that the employees and customers were on the floor. But as I wheeled to seek cover behind the shelves, one of the men shouted, "Abineye!" I ducked behind the shelves, only to be confronted by 3 uniformed gendarmes, all pointing pistols at me. They came at me from all sides then, men in uniform, men in plain clothes, and all pointing a pistol, shotgun, machine gun, or rifle at me. Orders cracked around my ears like whip pops. Hands up! Hands on your head! Up against the shelves, spread eagle! Face down on the floor! I had my hands up. I didn't know which of the other commands to obey, but I sure as hell didn't want to be shot. And some of the officers were handling their weapons in a manner that scared me. As a matter of fact, they were scaring their fellow officers. "For God's sake, don't shoot!" I shouted. "One of you tell me what you want me to do, and I'll do it." A tall, lean man with austere features pointed his pistol at me. "Get on the floor, face down," he barked. I did as he instructed, helped by several less than gentle hands. Rough hands twisted my arms up behind my back, and other uncaring hands clamped steel circlets tightly around my wrists. I was then hauled unceremoniously to my feet, and, surrounded by Charite detectives, Interpol agents, gendarmes, and God knows what other kind of fuzz, I was hustled out of the store and rudely shoved into the back seat of an unmarked sedan. I can't say French police are brutal, but I will say they handle suspects with undue firmness. I was driven directly to the Montpellier police station. No one said a word and wrote. At the station, the austere detective and 2 other officers, also Charite agents, ushered me into a small room. French policemen have a wide latitude in the handling of criminals, especially in interrogations of suspects. They get right to the point, dispensing with the reading of any rights a criminal may have. I don't think a crook has any rights in France. "My name is Marcel Gaston, of the Surete," said the lean officer in curt tones. "You are Frank Abagnale, are you not?" "I'm Robert Monjo," I said in indignant tones. "I'm a writer from California, an American. I'm afraid you gentlemen have made a very serious mistake." Gaston slapped me, a sharp stinging blow. "Most of the mistakes I make, monsieur, are serious mistakes, but I have not made a mistake in this instance. You are Frank Abagnale." "I am Robert Monjo," I said doggedly, searching their faces for a hint of doubt. One of the other surety agents stepped forward, his hand balled into a fist, but Gaston put out an arm and stopped him, without releasing me from his fixed stare. Then he shrugged. "We could beat it out of you, but that isn't necessary," he said. "I have all the time in the world, Abagnale, but I don't intend to waste too much of it on you. We can hold you until doomsday, or at least until we have located witnesses to identify you. Until then, unless you choose to cooperate, I am going to place you in the cell for common drunks and petty criminals. You can stay there for a week, 2 weeks, a month. It makes no difference to me. However, you will not be fed, and you will have no water until you decide to confess. Why don't you just tell us what we want to know right now? We know who you are. We know what you have done. You will only inconvenience yourself. One other thing, Abagnale. If you force us to go to a lot of trouble to get the information you could give us at this moment, I will not forget it, and you will always remember the consequences, I promise you." I looked at Gaston and knew he meant every word he had spoken. Marcel Gaston was one tough bastard. "I'm Frank Abagnale," I said. I never really gave them the kind of confession they wanted. I never volunteered any details on any of the offenses I'd committed in France. But if they knew of a particular caper and outlined it for me, I'd nod and say, "That's about the way it happened. All right." Or, "Yes, that was me." Gaston made up a document, setting down a lot of my crimes, the circumstances of my arrest and my interrogation. "And let me read it. If that is essentially correct, you will help yourself by signing it," he said. I couldn't quarrel with the instrument. He'd even included the fact that he'd slapped me. I signed it. The affidavit also disclosed how I'd been caught. Major airlines didn't serve Montpellier, but it was visited frequently by stewardesses and other flight personnel. An Air France flight attendant, visiting relatives in Montpellier, had spotted me shopping a couple of weeks past and had recognized me. She had seen me get into my car and had jotted down the license number. On her return to Paris, she had sought out her captain and told him of her suspicions. She was positive enough about her identification that her captain called the police. "I'm positive it's him. I dated him," she insisted. I never learned which Air France stewardess put the finger on me. No one would tell me. I had dallied with several over the years. I hoped it wasn't Monique, but to this day I still don't know the informant's identity. I don't think it was Monique, however. Had she seen me in Montpellier, she would have confronted me. I was kept 6 days in Montpellier, during which time several lawyers appeared to offer their services. I selected a middle-aged man whose mannerisms and appearance reminded me of Armand, although he frankly stated he didn't think he could win me my freedom. "I have gone over all the police documents, and they have you dead to rights," he commented. "The best we can hope for is a light sentence." I told him I'd settle for that. Scarcely a week after my arrest, to my astonishment, I was removed to Perpignan, and the day after my arrival there I was brought to trial in a court of assizes, made up of a judge, 2 assessors, prosecutors, and 9 citizen jurors, all of whom would jointly decide my guilt or innocence. It wasn't much of a trial, really, lasting less than 2 days. Gaston listed the charges against me and the evidence he'd gathered to support the accusations. There were ample witnesses available to appear against me. "How does the defendant plead?" inquired the judge of my attorney. "My client will offer no defense against these charges," replied the lawyer. "In the interest of time, we would like to sum up our position now." He then launched into an eloquent and impassioned plea for leniency in my behalf. He cited my youth, I was still not 21, and portrayed me as an unfortunate and confused young man, the product of a broken home, and still more of a delinquent than a criminal. He pointed out that a dozen other European nations, where I had perpetrated similar crimes, had placed formal demands for extradition, once my debt to France was paid. This young man will, in all probability, never see his native land for many, many years, and even when he does return home, he will return in chains and only to face prison there, argued the lawyer. I need not point out to this court the harshness of the prison life this young man will have to endure here. I asked the court to take that into account in setting a penalty. I was adjudged guilty, but at the time I thought jubilantly that my attorney, if he'd lost a battle, had won the war. The judge sentenced me to only 1 year in prison. I was remanded to Perpignan's prison, the house of arrest, a gloomy, forbidding stone fortress constructed in the 17th century. And not until I had been there for a few days did I realize just how lenient the judge had been. I was received by 2 guards who brusquely ordered me to strip, and who then escorted me, still naked, to an upper floor where I marched down a narrow corridor devoid of cells as such. On either side were only stone walls set with solid steel doors. The guards halted before one of the metal portals, and one unlocked and opened the door. It screeched open with a sound reminiscent of a horror movie, and the other guard shoved me inside the dark cubicle. I stumbled and fell forward, striking my head against the back of the cell, for the cell was a sunken one. I had not noted the 2 steps leading to the floor. I was never actually to see the steps. I was in total darkness, a damp, chilling, breath-stifling, frightening darkness. I stood up to grope around for the light switch and cracked my head against the steel ceiling. There was no light switch. There was no light in the cell. There was, in fact, nothing in the cell but a bucket. No bed, no toilet, no wash basin, no drain. Nothing. Just the bucket. The cell was not a cell. Actually, it was a hole. A raised dungeon, perhaps 5 feet wide, 5 feet high, and 5 feet deep, with ceiling and door of steel, and a floor and walls of stone. The ceiling and door were chilled to the touch. The walls wept chilly tears constantly. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. No light filtered into the cell from any source. There were no cracks in the overhead or walls. The ancient door to my steel and stone box seemed to blend itself into its aperture like a hermetic seal. My eyes did not adjust. The eyes do not adjust to total darkness. There was air entering the cell. Periodically, a cold draft explored my skin like clammy fingers, raising goosebumps as much from the eerie sensation as from the chill. I wondered whence it came. Whatever its channels, they also were dark. I slumped on the floor, shivering and feeling like I'd been entombed alive. Panic added to my shaking. I sought to calm myself by rationalizing my situation. Surely, I told myself, this was not to be the cell I would occupy during the entire year. Probably I was in here for observation. I discarded the theory immediately. Anyone observing me in this cell would have to have X-ray eyes. All right then, I was being given a taste of what could happen to me if I misbehaved. I clung to the second supposition. Yes, this treatment was calculated to ensure my good behavior once I was released among the general prison population. After all, only unruly prisoners were confined in solitary under such harsh conditions, weren't they? Certainly no civilized country would permit such cruel and inhumane punishment to be meted out by its prison warders without cause. France does, or did. I was not fed my first day in Perpignan's prison. I had been placed in my grim cell late in the afternoon. Several hours later, exhausted, cold, hungry, bewildered, frightened and desolate, I laid down on the hard floor and fell asleep. I slept curled in a ball, for I am 6 feet tall. The screeching of the door awakened me. I sat up, wincing from the soreness and cramps caused by my uncomfortable sleeping position. The dim form of a guard loomed in the doorway. He was placing something on the steps inside my crib. I was galvanized into action as he straightened and started to close the door. I shouted, scrambling forward and placing my hands against the inside of the door, trying to restrain its closing. Why am I being kept in here? How long will I stay in here? Until you have completed your sentence, he said, and shoved shut the door. The words clanked on my ears with the metallic finalness of the door slamming against the stone jamb. I fell back, stunned by the ghastly truth. A year? I was to live in this black coffin a year? Without light? Without bedding? Without clothing? Without toilet facilities? And without God knows what else? It was impossible, I told myself. No man could live in such a dark void, under such conditions, for a year. He would die, and his death would be slow and torturous. It would have been better had I been sentenced to the guillotine. I loved France, but what kind of country was it that countenanced such punishment for such a crime as mine? And if the government was ignorant of such prison conditions, the people unknowing, what manner of men were the French penologists into whose hands I had been delivered? Depraved monsters, madmen, perverts, undoubtedly. I was suddenly scared, actually fearful. I did not know how, or if, I could survive a year in this Stygian vault. I still have nightmares from my stay in Perpignan's house of arrest. Compared to Perpignan prison, the Black Hole of Calcutta was a health spa, Devil's Island, a vacation paradise. I had not expected prison life to be easy. My one experience behind bars, and then, for only a few hours, had convinced me that jails and prisons were not nice places to reside. But nothing I had ever read, heard or seen had ever indicated that imprisonment could be as brutal and heartless as this. I felt around and located the food the guard had brought full. It was a quart container of water and a small loaf of bread. The simple breakfast had not even been brought on a tray. The guard had simply set the container of water on the top step and had dropped the bread beside it on the stone. No matter. I wolfed down the loaf of bread and gulped down the water in one swig. Then I huddled miserably against the wet granite wall and contemplated the machinations of French justice. Mine was not a term in prison. It was an ordeal designed to destroy the mind and body. The menu in Perpignan prison never varied. For breakfast, I was served bread and water. Lunch consisted of a weak chicken soup and a loaf of bread. Supper was a cup of black coffee and a loaf of bread. The monotonous diet varied only in the time it was served, or in the order it was served. I had no means of telling time, and I soon lost track of the days, and the guards who served the meals further confused my attempts to keep a mental timetable and calendar by alternating the schedule of my meager rations. For instance, for several days breakfast, lunch, and dinner might be served regularly at 7, noon, and 5. But then, abruptly, dinner would be served at 10 a, supper at 2 p, and breakfast at 6 p. I am estimating the times. I really never knew at what hour I was fed, or whether it was day or night, and not infrequently I was fed only 1 or 2 times daily. Occasionally I wasn't fed at all during the span of the day. I never left the cell. Not once during my stay in the hoary jail was I permitted outside for exercise or recreation. If the prison had a day room where prisoners might read, write letters, listen to the radio, watch television, or play games, I was not among those privileged to share the facility. I was not allowed to write letters, and if any of my relatives knew I was jailed at Perpignan and wrote me, I did not receive the mail. My requests made of the guards who served the meals to contact my relatives, my attorney, the Red Cross, the warden, or the American consular authorities were ignored save once. On that occasion, the guard smacked me alongside the head with his huge hand. "Don't talk to me," he growled. "It is not permitted. Don't talk, don't sing, don't whistle, don't hum, don't make any sound, or you will be beaten." He slammed the heavy door shut on further pleas. The bucket was my latrine. I was not given any toilet paper, nor was the bucket removed after use. I soon adapted to the stench, but after a few days the bucket overflowed, and I had to move around and sleep in my own fecal matter. I was too numbed, in body and spirit, to be revolted. Eventually, however, the odor became too nauseating for even the guards to endure, apparently. One day, between meals, the door creaked open, and another convict scurried in with the furtiveness and manner of a rat, grabbed the bucket and fled. It was returned, empty, a few minutes later. On perhaps half a dozen other occasions during my time in the tiny tomb, the procedure was repeated. But only twice during my imprisonment were the feces cleaned from the floor of the cell. Each time a guard stood by at the door, while an inmate hosed out the cell, and then picked up the accumulated water in thick hole with a mop. Both times I managed a makeshift shower in the spray of the hose, daring the wrath of the guard. Both times the cleaning was performed in absolute silence. Those were the only times I was able to cleanse myself to any extent during my term, although occasionally I used a portion of my water ration to rinse my hands or to anoint my face. I was not allowed to shave, nor was I ever given a haircut. I am hirsute by heritage, and without the means to curb their growth, my hair and beard sprouted prodigiously. My hair was soon below my shoulders, a tangled, sodden skein, and my beard brushed my chest. Both hair and beard were oiled and perfumed with excrement, for I could not avoid soiling myself in my own wastes. Lice and other insects small enough to gain admittance to the fetid cell nested in my body hair and feasted on my flesh. I developed sores from my scratching, and these became infected from contact with the always present filth. My body soon became a mass of scabs, a living petri dish for the culture of myriad forms of bacteria, in the cramped confines of the hole, shrouded in blackness. I lost my sense of balance, and fell often as I attempted to move about, stretch myself, or perform simple exercises, nicking or bruising myself against the rough walls or the hard floor, and further adding to my wounds. I weighed 210 pounds when I was received at Perpignan. The tedious diet did not contain enough nutrients or calories to maintain me. My body began to feed upon itself, the muscles and tendons devouring the stored fats and oily tissues in order to fuel the pumps of my heart and my circulatory system. Within weeks, I was able to encircle my biceps with my fingers. I was not alone in my misery. I soon concluded that most, if not all, of the steel doors in Perpignan prison sealed a wretched inmate. The stone walls between the cells were too thick to permit talk between adjoining prisoners, but they were by no means soundproof. Unintelligible shouts and curses, screams of pain and anguish, and muffled groans and cries washed softly along the corridor outside, almost constantly, sometimes ceasing abruptly only to start again within minutes. The sounds, always laden with despair, permeated the walls of my dank box, filtering through the stone and seeping up from the floor like the sighs and sobs of some beleaguered banshee. Sometimes, however, the sounds had the qualities of rage and anger, reminiscent of the distant howl of a hunting wolf or the defiant yipping of a hurt coyote. Sometimes the sounds were my own, for in my loneliness I often talked to myself just to hear the sound of a human voice. Or I would stand stooped before the door and scream at the guards to let me out, or demand that I be treated like a human being, with dignity and consideration, if not respect. I cursed them. I cursed myself. I ranted and raved, wept and screamed, chanted and sang, laughed and bellowed, shouted and banged the bucket against the walls, splattering excrement all over my crate-like cell. I felt I was going mad. I had no doubt that many of the men in Perpignan were mad, reduced to lunacy by the maniacal manner in which they were treated. I was certain after a few weeks that I would lose my own sanity. I lost the ability to distinguish between that which was real and that which was unreal, and began to hallucinate. I would find myself back in the royal gardens, surrounded by my lovely crew, dining sumptuously on lobster or roast beef, or strolling along the golden beaches of the Costa Brava, my arm around Monique, only to regain my reason in the damp dungeon that was reality, wallowing in my own excreta and cursing the fates that had condemned me to Perpignan. I think that I actually would have gone mad and died a lunatic in Perpignan prison had it not been for my vivid imagination, the creative ability that had enabled me to concoct the brilliant swindles I had perpetrated over the years, and which had resulted in my present plight, now served as a lifeguard. If I were going to hallucinate, I determined, mine would be planned hallucinations, and so I began to produce my own fantasies. I would sit on the floor, for instance, and recall the image I presented in my airline uniform and pretend that I was a real pilot, commander of a 707. And suddenly the cramped, vile and oozy pit in which I was prisoner became a sleek, clean jetliner, crowded with joyful, excited passengers attended by chic, glamorous stewardesses. I employed all the airline jargon I'd acquired over the years as I pretended to taxi the plane away from the terminal, obtain takeoff clearance from the tower and jockey the great machine into the air, leveling off at 35,000 feet. Then I'd pick up the PA mic. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 502 of Abagnale Airlines, Seattle to Denver. We're presently cruising at miles per hour, and we expect good weather, and thus a good flight, all the way to Denver. Those of you seated on the starboard side, that's the right side of the aircraft, should have a good view of Mount Rainier below and off in the distance. Mount Rainier, with an elevation of 14,410 feet, is, as you probably know, the highest peak in Washington state. Of course, I was a hero at times, fighting my huge plane through terrible storms or overcoming dire mechanical disasters to deliver my human cargo safely and to bask in the gratitude of the passengers, especially the women, especially the pretty women. Or, I would imagine I was a tour bus driver, displaying the splendors of the Grand Canyon or the enchantments of San Antonio, New Orleans, Rome, New York City. I actually remembered that New York City had enchantments, or some other historic city, to a group of rapt tourists, entertaining them with my rapid, witty spiel. Now, the mansion on your left, ladies and gentlemen, is the home of J. Greenstuff, one of the city's founders. He made big money most of his life. Trouble is, he made it too big, and now he's spending the rest of his life in a federal prison. In my fantasies, I was anyone I wanted to be, much as I'd been during the 5 years before my arrest, although I added to and amplified my Perpignan impersonations. I was a famous surgeon, operating on the president and saving his life with my medical skills. A great author, winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. A movie director, making an Oscar-winning epic. A mountain guide, rescuing hapless climbers trapped on a dangerous mountain face. I was tinker, tailor, Indian chief, baker, banker, and ingenious thief. For I sometimes restaged some of my more memorable capers, and some of my more memorable love scenes, too. But always the curtain had to come down on my plays, and I returned to reality. But, knowing I'd been on a make-believe journey, in my chill, gloomy, dark, and loathsome cell. Walter Mitty, endurance vile. One day the door grated open at an unexpected time, and a guard tossed something into my cell. It was a thin, dirty, evil-smelling mattress, hardly more than a tick, but I spread it out on the floor and curled up on it, reveling in its comfort. I fell asleep wondering what model deportment I exhibited that deserved such a luxurious reward. I was awakened by the mattresses being jerked savagely from beneath me by a burly guard, who laughed jeeringly as he slammed the steel door shut. I do not know what time it was. It was long before I was served breakfast, however. Sometime after dinner, the door shrieked open again, and the mattress was dumped on the steps. I grabbed it and fell on its softness, fondling it like it was a woman. But again, I was rudely awakened by a guard's removing the tick forcefully from under me. And yet again, at some unknown hour later, the mattress was plopped onto the steps. The truth dawned. The guards were playing a game with me, a cruel and barbaric game, but a game nonetheless. Some of their other mice have died, I told myself, and I ignored the betting. My body had become accustomed to the smooth stone floor, or at least as accustomed to it as any blending of soft flesh and hard rock. I never used the tick again, although the guards continued providing it each night, in hopes, I supposed, that I would again use it and furnish them more sport. In my 5th month in Perpignan's house of arrest, a fact established later, there was a tap on the outside of my cell door, and then a portion of it slid open, admitting a weak, filtered light. I was astonished, for I had been aware the door had a sliding panel, so cunningly was it contrived. "Frank Abagnale?" asked a voice unmistakably American. I floundered to the door and peered out. Standing on the outer side of the corridor, where he had recoiled from the stench, was a tall, skinny man with an equally bony face, in the act of putting a handkerchief over his mouth and nostrils. "I'm Frank Abagnale," I said eagerly. "Are you an American? Are you with the FBI?" "I'm Peter Ramsey, and I'm from the American consulate in Marseille," replied the thin man, removing the handkerchief from his face. "How are you doing?" I stared at him, astonished. My God, he acted like we were talking over a glass of wine in some Marseille sidewalk cafe. Words suddenly started cascading from my mouth like gravel from a sluice. "How am I doing?" I repeated his query in near hysterical tones. "I'll tell you how I'm doing. I'm sick, I'm sore, I'm naked, I'm hungry, and I'm covered with lice. I don't have a bed. I don't have a toilet. I don't have a wash basin. I'm sleeping in my own shit. I have no light, no razor, no toothbrush, no nothing. I don't know what time it is. I don't know what day it is. I don't know what month it is. I don't even know what year it is, for Christ's sake. I'm being treated like a mad dog. I'll probably go mad if I stay in here much longer. I'm dying in here. That's how I'm doing." I slumped against the door, exhausted from my tirade. Ramsey's features, save for an obvious reaction to the odor emanating from my cell, did not change. He nodded impassively when I finished. "I see," he said calmly. "Well, perhaps I should explain my visit. You see, I make the rounds of my district about twice a year, calling on Americans in this district, and I learned only recently that you were here. Now, before you get your hopes up, let me tell you now that I am powerless to assist you. I am aware of the conditions here, and of the way you're being treated. And it's precisely because of that treatment that I can't do anything. You see, Abagnale, you're being treated exactly the same as every Frenchman who's confined here is treated. They're not doing anything to you that they're not doing to the man on either side of you. To the man in each cell in the prison, in fact. Each of them has the same accommodation as you. Each is living in the same filth. Each is eating the same food. Each is denied the privileges you're denied. You haven't been singled out for especially harsh treatment, Abagnale. And as long as they treat you as they treat their own, I can't do a damn thing about your predicament, not even complain. The minute they discriminate against you, or treat you differently, because you're an American, a foreigner, then I can step in and complain. It may not do any good, but I could then intervene in your behalf. But as long as they mete out the same punishment to you as they do to their own, that's it. French prisons are French prisons. It's always been like this, to my knowledge. And it'll always be like this. They don't believe in rehabilitation. They believe in an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In short, they believe in punishment for a convicted criminal, and you're a convicted criminal. You're lucky, really. It used to be worse than this, if you can believe it. Prisoners were once beaten daily. As long as you're not being specifically abused by someone, there's nothing I can do. His words fell on my ears like whip strokes across my back. I felt like a death sentence had been pronounced on me. Then Ramsay, with the ghost of a grin, handed me a reprieve. "It is my understanding that you only have another 30 days or so here," he said. "You won't be freed, of course. I am told that authorities from another country, which one I don't know, are coming to take you into custody for trial in that country. Wherever you go, you're bound to be treated better than this. Now, if you'd like me to write your parents and let them know where you are, or if you want me to get in touch with anyone else, I'll be glad to do so." His was a generous gesture, one he didn't have to make, and I was tempted, but only momentarily. "No, that won't be necessary," I said. "Thank you anyway, Mr. Darcy." He nodded again. "Good luck to you, Abagnale," he said. He turned and seemed to disappear in a radiant explosion. I jumped back, shielding my eyes and screaming with pain. It was only later that I knew what had happened. The lights in the corridor were variable power lights. When a cell door was opened or a peephole broached, the lights were dimmed, low enough to avoid damage to the eyes of the prisoner who lived like a mole in his lightless hole. When a visitor like Ramsay appeared, the lights were turned up, so he might see his way. Once he halted in front of my cell, the lights had been dimmed. When he left, a guard had hit the bright switch prematurely. A concern for their sight was the only consideration accorded prisoners in Perpignan's house of arrest. After Ramsay left, I sat down against the wall, and after the pain in my eyes had subsided, mulled the information he'd imparted. Was my sentence nearly over? Had it really been 11 months since I was shoved into this awful crypt? I didn't know. I had lost all sense of time, but I felt he had told me the truth. I tried to keep count of the days thereafter, to tally 30 days on the almanac of my mind, but it was impossible. You simply can't keep a calendar in a feculent vacuum, void of light, where any segment of time, if such existed, was devoted to surviving. I am sure it was only a few days before I returned to just holding on to my sanity. Still, time passed, and one day the panel in the door opened, admitting the dim light that, with the one exception, "Turn around, face the back of your cell and shut your eyes," a voice ordered gruffly. I did as instructed, my heart hammering. Was this the day of my release, or was something else in store for me? "Do not turn around, but open your eyes slowly and let them get accustomed to the light," the voice instructed. "I will leave this open for an hour, then I'll be back." I slowly opened my eyes and found myself surrounded by a bright golden glow, too bright for my weak orbs. I had to shut them against the glare. Gradually, however, my pupils adjusted to the illumination, and I was able to look around me without squinting and without pain. Even so, the cell was still gloomy, like twilight on a rainy day. An hour later, the guard returned, or at least the voice sounded the same. "Close your eyes again," he instructed. "I am going to turn up the lights further." I did so, and when he instructed me to do so, I opened my eyes slowly and cautiously. The tiny cubicle was flooded with a luminous glare, causing me to squint again. The radiance ringed the cell like a nimbus around a dark star, illuminating fully for the first time the interior of the tiny vault. I was appalled and sickened as I looked around. The walls were moist and crusted with slimy mold. The ceiling, too, glistened with moisture. The floor was filthy with excrement, and the bucket, unemptied for some time, teemed with maggots. The odious worms were also slithering around the floor. I vomited. It was perhaps another hour before the guard returned. This time, he opened the door. "Come with me," he ordered. I scrambled from the foul cave without hesitation, experiencing shooting pains in my neck, shoulders, arms and legs as I straightened up for the first time since my arrival. I had difficulty walking, but I waddled after the guard like a half-drunk duck, sometimes steadying myself by putting a hand against the wall. He led me downstairs and into a sparsely furnished room. "Stand here," he ordered, and disappeared through an open door that led to another chamber. I turned, inspecting the room, marveling at its size and spaciousness after so long in my moldy burrow, and then stopped as I suddenly confronted the most hideous creature I had ever encountered. It was a man. It had to be a man. But God in heaven, what manner of man was this? He was tall and emaciated, his head crowned by a dirty, unkempt thatch of hair that spilled to his waist, his face hidden by a filthy, matted beard that fell to his belly. Spittle drooled from the slash that was his mouth, and his eyes were wildly glowing coals in their sunken sockets. He was naked, and his flesh was coated with filth, sores, and scabs, lending it a leprous appearance. The nails of his fingers and toes were grown out, elongated and curved, like the talons of a vulture. Indeed, he looked like a vulture. I shuddered as I regarded the apparition. I shuddered again as recognition loomed. I was facing myself in a mirror. I was still horrified at my appearance when the guard returned, clothing draped over his arm and a pair of shoes in his hand. I recognized the apparel as mine, the clothes I was wearing when I was received in the prison. "Put these on," said the guard brusquely, handing me the garments and dropping the shoes on the floor. "Can I shower and shave first, please?" I asked. "No, put on the clothes," he said, giving me a malevolent look. I hurriedly garbed my filthy frame in the clothes, which were now several sizes too large for me. My belt was missing. I clutched the trousers around my wasted stomach and looked at the guard. He stepped into the next room and returned with a length of cotton rope. I cinched the waist of my trousers with that. Almost immediately, 2 gendarmes appeared, one of them carrying an array of restraints. One of them cinched a thick leather belt with a ring bolt in the front, around my waist, while the other fastened heavy shackles around my ankles. I was then handcuffed, and a long, slender steel chain was looped around my neck, and the handcuff chain, threaded through the ring bolt, and fastened with a lock to the chain connecting my leg irons. Neither officer said a word as they trussed me. One then pointed toward the door and gave me a light shove as his partner led the way through the exit. I shuffled after him, unable to walk because of the leg irons and fearful of my destination. I had never been chained like this before. I considered such restraints only for violent, dangerous criminals. "Where are we going? Where are you taking me?" I asked, squinting in the late afternoon sunlight. It was even more brilliant than the lights inside. Neither of them bothered to answer me. Silently, they placed me in the back seat of an unmarked sedan, and one climbed behind the wheel as the other seated himself beside me. They drove me to the railroad station. The afternoon light, even sheltered as I was in the car, made me dizzy and nauseous. The nausea was not all due to my sudden exposure to daylight after all these months, I knew. I'd been ill, feverish, vomiting, diarrhea, and racked at times by chills for the past month or so. I had not complained to the guards in Perpignan. They would have ignored me, as they had ignored all my other pleas and protests. At the railroad station, I was taken from the car, and one of the gendarmes snapped one end of a light chain onto my belt. He wrapped the other end around his one hand and leashed like a dog. I was led and dragged through the people assembled at the depot and shoved onto the train. The conductor showed us to a glassed-in compartment containing 2 benches, the door of which was adorned with a sign stating the booth was reserved for the Ministry of Justice. The other passengers looked at me in horror, shock or revulsion as we passed among them, some falling back in disgust as they detected my odor. I had long since lost all olfactory sensitivity to my own feculence, but I could sympathize with them. I had to smell like a convention of outraged skunks. The compartment was large enough to accommodate 8 persons, and as the train filled and all the seats were occupied, several sturdy peasants at various times appeared and sought permission to ride in the compartment with us. They seemed oblivious to my malodorous condition. Each time the gendarmes waved them on with a curt refusal. Then 3 vivacious, pretty American girls appeared, dressed in a minimum of silks and nylon, and festooned with shopping bags laden with souvenirs and gifts, wines and foods. They reeked delightfully of precious perfumes, and with a broad smile. One gendarme rose and gallantly seated them on the opposite bench. They immediately tried to engage the officers in conversation, curious as to who I was and what my crime had been. Obviously, ensnared in chains as I was some notorious, terrible murderer, on a par at least with Jack the Ripper. They seemed more fascinated than frightened, and animatedly discussed my offensive stench. "He smells like they've been keeping him in a sewer," remarked one. The others laughingly agreed. I did not want them to know I was an American. I felt degraded and ashamed of my appearance in their presence. The gendarmes finally made the 3 young women understand that they neither spoke nor understood English, and the 3 fell to talking among themselves as the train pulled out of the station. I did not know where we were going. I had no sense of direction at the moment, and I thought it would be useless to again seek my destination from the gendarmes. I huddled miserably between the officers, ill and despondent, occasionally looking out at the passing landscape or covertly studying the girls. I gathered from their conversational comments that they were school teachers from the Philadelphia area and were in Europe on a vacation. They'd been to Spain, Portugal, and the Pyrenees, and were now journeying to some other enchanted area. Were we en route to Paris, I wondered? As the miles passed, I grew hungry, despite my feeling of sickness. The girls took cheeses and breads from their bags, canned pates and wine, and began to eat, sharing their repast with the gendarmes. One attempted to feed me a small sandwich. My hands were restrained, so that I could not have eaten had I been allowed. But one gendarme grasped her wrist gently. "No," he said firmly. At some point, some hours after we left Perpignan, the young women, convinced that neither I nor the gendarmes could understand English, commenced discussing the amorous adventures they'd been having on vacation, and in such intimate detail that I was astonished. They compared the physical attributes, prowess and performance of their various lovers in such vivid language that I actually felt embarrassed. I'd never heard women engage in such locker room tales, replete with all the 4-letter words and lewd comments. I concluded I still had a lot to learn about women, and at the same time, I speculated as to my own standing. Had I been a participant in their sexual Olympics, I made a mental note to try out for their games should we ever meet again. Our destination was Paris. The gendarmes hauled me to my feet, made their farewells to the ladies, and hustled me off the train, but not before I'd said my own goodbye. As I was pulled through the door of the compartment, I twisted my head and smiled lasciviously at the 3 young teachers. "Say hello to everyone in Philly for me," I said in my best Bronx voice. The expressions on their faces buoyed my sagging ego. I was driven to the Prefecture de Police jail in Paris and turned over to the Préfet de Police, a plump, balding man with sleek jowls and cold, remorseless eyes. Nonetheless, those eyes registered shock and disgust at my appearance, and he set about promptly remedying my image. An officer escorted me to a shower, and after I had washed myself clean of my accumulated filth, an inmate barber was summoned to snave my beard and shear my mane. I was then escorted to a cell, a small and austere little cubicle in reality, but sheer luxury compared to my previous prison accommodations. And less than, there was a narrow iron cot with a wafer of a mattress and coarse, clean sheets, a tiny wash basin, and an honest-to-John toilet. There was also a light controlled from the outside. You may read until 9 o'clock. The light goes out then, the guard informed me. I didn't have anything to read. Look, I'm sick, I said. Can I see a doctor, please? I will ask, he said. He returned an hour later, bearing a tray on which reposed a bowl of thin stew, a loaf of bread, and a container of coffee. No, doctor, he said. I am sorry. I think he meant it. The stew had meat in it and was a veritable feast for me. In fact, the meager meal was too rich for my stomach, which was unaccustomed to such hearty fare. I vomited the food within an hour after dining. I was still unaware of my circumstances. I didn't know whether I would be brought to trial again in Paris, whether I was to complete my term here or be handed over to some other government. All my queries were rebuffed. I was not to stay in Paris, however. The following morning, after a breakfast of coffee, bread and cheese which I managed to keep inside me, I was taken from my cell and again shackled like a wild animal. A pair of gendarmes placed me in a windowed van, my feet secured by a chain to a bolt in the floor, and started on a route that I soon recognized. I was being driven to Orly Airport. At the airport, I was taken from the van and escorted through the terminal to the Scandinavian Airlines service counter. My progress through the terminal attracted a maximum of attention, and people even left cafes and bars to gawk at me as I shuffled along, my chains clinking and rattling. I recognized the one clerk behind the SAS counter. She'd once cashed a phony check for me. I couldn't now remember the amount. If she recognized me, she gave no indication of it. However, the man she'd cashed a check for had been a robust 200-pounder, tanned and healthy. The chained prisoner before her now was a sick, pallid-faced skeleton of a man, stooped and hollow-eyed. In fact, after one look at me, she kept her eyes averted. Look, it won't hurt for you to tell me what's going on, I pleaded with the gendarmes, who were scanning the human traffic in the vicinity of the ticket counter. We are waiting for the Swedish police, one said in abrupt tones. Now, shut up. Don't speak to us again. He was suddenly confronted by a petite and shapely young woman with long blonde hair and brilliant blue eyes, smartly dressed in a tailored blue suit, over which she wore a fashionably cut trench coat. She carried a thin leather case under one arm. Behind her loomed a younger, taller Valkyrie, similarly attired, also holding an attaché case tucked under an arm. Is this Frank Abagnale? The smaller one asked of the gendarme on my left. He stepped in front of me, holding up his hand. That is none of your business, he snapped. At any rate, he is not allowed visitors. If this man is a friend of yours, you will not be allowed to talk to him. The blue eyes flashed and the small shoulders squared. I will talk to him, officer, and you will take those chains off him, at once. Her tone was imperiously demanding. Then she smiled at me, and the eyes were warm, the features gentle. You are Frank Abagnale, are you not? She asked in perfect English. May I call you Frank? Chapter 10 put out an APB. Frank Abagnale has escaped. The two gendarmes were transfixed in amazement. Two grizzly bears suddenly challenged by a chipmunk. I myself stood gaping at the lovely apparition who demanded that I be released from my chains and who seemed determined to take me from my tormentors. She extended a slender hand and placed it on my arm. I am Inspector Jan Lundström of the Swedish police, the National Police Force, she said, and gestured to the pretty girl behind her. This is my assistant, Inspector Kirsten Berglund, and we are here to escort you back to Sweden, where, as I am sure you are aware, you face a criminal proceeding. As she talked, she extracted a small leather folder from her pocket and opened it to display to the French officers her credentials and a small gold badge. The gendarme, perplexed, looked at his partner. The second gendarme displayed the sheaf of papers. "He is her prisoner," he said with a shrug. "Take off the chains." I was unshackled. The crowd applauded, an ovation accompanied by a whistling and stamping of feet. Inspector Lundstrom drew me aside. "I wish to make some things perfectly clear, Frank," she said. "We do not normally use handcuffs or other restraints in Sweden. I never carry them myself, and you will not be restrained in any way during our journey. But our flight makes a stop in Denmark, and my country has had to post a bond to ensure your passage through Denmark. It is a normal procedure in these cases. We will be on the ground only an hour in Denmark, Frank, but I have a responsibility to the French government, to the Danish government, and to my own government to see that you are brought to Sweden in custody, that you do not escape. Now, I can assure you that you will find Swedish jails and prisons far different from French prisons. We like to think our prisoners are treated humanely. But let me tell you this, Frank. I am armed. Kirsten is armed. We are both versed in the use of our weapons. If you try to run, if you make an attempt to escape, we will have to shoot you. And if we shoot you, Frank, we will kill you. Is that understood?" The words were spoken calmly and without heat, much in the manner, in fact, of giving directions to a stranger. Cooperative, but not really friendly. She opened the large purse she carried on a shoulder strap. Bulking among its contents was a .45 semi-automatic pistol. I looked at Inspector Berglund. She smiled angelically and patted her own purse. "Yes, I understand," I said. I really thought she was bluffing. Neither of my lovely captors impressed me as an Annie Oakley. Inspector Lundstrom turned to the clerk behind the ticket counter. "We're ready," she said. The girl nodded and summoned another clerk, a young man, from a room behind her. He led us through an office behind the counter, through the baggage area, through operations, and to the plane's boarding stairwell. Save for the shabby clothing I was wearing, we appeared to be just 3 more passengers. And from the lack of interest in my appearance, I was probably regarded as just another hippie. We were fed on the plane before we landed in Copenhagen. It was the usual meager airline meal, but deliriously prepared. And it was the first decent meal I'd had since being committed to prison. For me, it was a delightful feast, and I had to force myself to refuse my escort's offer of their portions. We had a longer layover in Denmark than was expected. 2 hours. The 2 young officers promptly escorted me to one of the terminal's restaurants and ordered a lavish lunch for the 3 of us, although I'm sure they couldn't have been hungry again. I felt it was strictly an attempt to appease my still ravenous hunger, but I didn't protest. Before we boarded the plane again, they bought me several candy bars and some English language magazines. Throughout the trip, they treated me as if I were a friend rather than a prisoner. They insisted I call them by their given names. They conversed with me as friends, inquiring about my family, my likes, my dislikes, and other general subjects. They probed only briefly into my criminal career, and then only to ask about my horrible treatment in Perpignan prison. I was surprised to learn I had served only 6 months in that hellhole. I had lost all track of time. As a foreigner, you were not eligible for parole, but the judge had discretion to reduce your term, and he did so, said Jan. I was suddenly grateful to the stern jurist who'd sentenced me. Knowing that I had served only 6 months, I realized I would not have lasted a full year in Perpignan. Few prisoners did. The plane landed in Malmö, Sweden, 30 minutes after leaving Copenhagen. To my surprise, we disembarked in Malmö, retrieved our luggage, and Jan and Kirsten led the way to a marked police car. A Swedish black and white parked in the terminal lot, a uniformed officer at the wheel. He helped load our luggage, the girls' luggage, really, since I had none, into the trunk, and then drove us to the police station in the village of Klippen, a short distance from Malmö. I was intrigued by the Klippen police station. It seemed more like a quaint old inn than a police precinct. A ruddy-faced, smiling sergeant of police greeted us. Jan and Kirsten in Swedish, me in only slightly accented English. He shook my hand as if he were greeting a guest. "I have been expecting you, mister. I have all your papers here." "Sergeant, Frank needs a doctor," said Jan in English. "He is very ill, I'm afraid, and needs immediate attention." It was nearly 9 p.m., but the sergeant merely nodded. "At once, Inspector Lundstrom," he said, beckoning to a young uniformed officer who stood watching the scene. "Carl, please take the prisoner to his quarters." "Ja, Mynheer," he said, and grinned at me. "If you will follow me, please." I followed him in somewhat of a daze. If this was the treatment accorded criminals in Sweden, how did they treat honest folk? He led me down the hall to a huge oaken door, which he unlocked, opened, and then stood aside for me to enter. I was stunned when I stepped inside. This was no cell. It was an apartment, a huge, spacious room with a great picture window overlooking the village, a large bed with carved head and footboard, and a colorful spread, rustic furniture, and a separate bathroom with both a tub and a shower. Prints of gallant scenes from Sweden's past decorated the walls, and tasteful drapes, drawn at the moment, afforded privacy from outside passers-by. "I hope you will be well soon, Mynheer," said Carl in his accented English before closing the door. "Thank you," I replied. I didn't know what else to say, although I wanted to say more. After his departure, I inspected the room closely. The windows were thick plate glass and could not be opened, and the door also could not be opened from the inside, but no matter. I had no thoughts of escape from this prison. I didn't get to sleep in the bed that night. Within minutes, the door opened again to admit Jan and a balding, amiable but very efficient doctor. "Strip, please," he said in English. I hesitated, but Jan made no move to leave, so I peeled my scant attire, really embarrassed to stand naked before her. Her face mirrored nothing but concern, however. Nudity, I learned, is sexual only under the circumstances with the Swedes. The doctor poked, prodded, looked, and listened, using a variety of instruments, and tapped, felt, and pressed, all in silence. Before he put away his instruments and stethoscope and nodded, "This man is suffering from severe malnutrition and vitamin deficiency, but worst of all, he has, in my opinion, double pneumonia," he said. "I suggest you call an ambulance, Inspector." "Yes, doctor," said Jan, and ran from the room. Within 30 minutes, I was ensconced in a private room in a small, clean, and efficient hospital. I was there a month, recuperating, a uniformed officer outside my door at all times, but seeming more a companion than a guard. Each day, either Jan or Kirsten, the sergeant or Carl, visited me, and each time they brought me something, a bouquet, candy, a magazine, or some other little gift. Not once during my hospital stay was I questioned about my alleged crimes, nor was any reference made to my upcoming trial or the charges against me. I was returned to my cell at the end of the month before lunch, and at noon Carl brought me a menu. "We do not have a kitchen," he said apologetically. "You may order what you wish from this, and we will bring it from the cafe. It is very good food, I assure you." It certainly was. Within a month, I was back nudging 200 pounds. The day following my release from the hospital, John called on me, accompanied by a thin man with sprightly features. "I am Inspector Jan Lundstrom, with the Swedish National Police," she said formally. "It is my duty to tell you that you will be held here for a period of time, and that it is also my duty to interrogate you. This is a minister, and he will act as interpreter. He speaks perfect English and is familiar with all of your American slang and idioms." I was flabbergasted. "Oh, come on, Jan, you speak perfect English yourself," I protested. "What is this?" "Swedish law requires that an interpreter fluent in the language of a prisoner be present when that prisoner is questioned. If he or she is a foreigner," said Jan, still speaking in correct tones, as if she had never seen me before. "The law also says you have the right to an attorney, and your attorney must be present at all times during your interrogation. Since you have no funds to retain a lawyer, the government of Sweden has appointed you a counsel. Her name is Elsa Christiansen, and she will meet with you later today. Do you understand everything I have told you?" "Perfectly," I said. "I will see you tomorrow then," she said, and left. An hour later, there was a knock on my door, and then the portal opened. It was one of the guards with my supper, a bountiful and tasteful meal. which he arranged on a portable table, as if he were a waiter and not a jailer. When he returned to gather up the dishes, he grinned at me. "Would you like to take a walk?" he asked. "It will only be in the building as I make my rounds, but I thought perhaps you might be getting tired of being shut inside." I accompanied him to the kitchen, where a waiter from a nearby restaurant took the tray and used dishes from him. The kitchen was not really a kitchen, just a nook where the guards could brew coffee for themselves. He then led me on a tour of the jail, a 2-story affair that could accommodate only 20 prisoners. At each cell, he knocked before opening the door, greeted the occupant pleasantly, and inquired of the prisoner's needs. He bade each a cheery good night before closing and locking the door. When I returned to my cell, Elsa Christiansen was waiting for me, as was the interpreter, Rev. Carl Greek. I wondered at his presence until he explained that Mistress Christiansen did not speak any English at all, nor did she spend any time inquiring about any case. She merely acknowledged the introduction and then told me she would be on hand the next morning, when John commenced her interrogation. She was a tall, handsome woman of about 40, I judged, serene and courteous. But I had misgivings about her acting as my lawyer. Still, I had no choice. I had no funds to hire an attorney of my choice. The French police had seized all my assets in France, or so I presumed. They had not mentioned anything about my loot following my arrest or during my detention, and they certainly hadn't returned any money to me on my release. And here in Sweden, I had no way of getting funds from one of my many caches. Jan appeared the next morning with Mistress Christiansen and Herr Greek. She commenced immediately to question me about my criminal activities in Sweden, with Bergen translating her queries for Mistress Christiansen, who sat silent, merely nodding now and then. I was evasive with Jan during the first 2 interrogative sessions. Either I refused to answer or I would reply, "I don't remember," or "I can't say." On the 3rd day, Jan became exasperated. She exclaimed, "Why are you so defensive? Why are you so evasive? You're here, you're going to go to trial, and it would be much better for you if you are honest with me. We know who you are, and we know what you've done, and you know we have the evidence. Why are you so reluctant to talk?" "Because I don't want to go to prison for 20 years, even if it is a nice prison like this one," I replied bluntly. Bergen translated for Mistress. The reaction of all 3 was totally unexpected. They burst into laughter, the loud, tear-producing peals of laughter, usually provoked only by fine slapstick comedy. I sat looking at them in amazement. Jan calmed herself somewhat, but still shaking with delight, she looked at me. 20 years, she gulped. "Or 5 years, or 10 years, or whatever," I replied defensively, irritated at their attitude. "5 years? 10 years?" Jan exclaimed. "Frank, the maximum penalty for the crime you are charged with is 1 year. And I will be very surprised if you receive that much time, since you are a first offender. Frank, murderers and bank robbers rarely receive over 10 years on conviction in this country. What you did is a very serious offense, but we consider a year in prison a very serious punishment. And I assure you, that is the maximum sentence you face." I gave her a complete confession, detailing what I could recall of my transactions in Sweden. A week later, I was brought to trial in Malmö before a jury of 8 men and women who would determine both my guilt and my guilt. Punishment, my confession having excluded any question of innocence. Yet I almost beat the rap, or Mistress Christiansen did. She surprised me by challenging the whole proceedings at the close of testimony against me. The charge against me was serious fraud by check, she told the presiding judge. I would point out to the court that the instruments introduced here today are not checks, as defined by Swedish law. She contended, they are instruments he made up himself. They never were checks. They are not checks at this time. Under Swedish law, Your Honor, these instruments could never be checks, since they are utter counterfeits. Under the law, Your Honor, my client has not really forged any checks, since these instruments are not checks, but merely creations of his own. and therefore the charges against him should be dismissed. The charges weren't dismissed, but they were reduced to a lesser felony, the equivalent of obtaining money under false pretenses, and the jury sentenced me to 6 months in prison. I considered it a victory and rendered my enthusiastic thanks to Mistress Christensen, who was also pleased with the verdict. I was returned to my cell in the Clippan jail, and the next day Joan appeared to congratulate me. However, she also had disquieting news. I was not to serve my time in my comfortable and homey little hostelry in Clippan, but was to be transferred to the state institution in Malmo, located on the campus of Lund University, the oldest college in Europe. You will find it very different from the prisons in France. In fact, it is very different from any of your American prisons, Jan assured me. My misgivings evaporated when I was delivered to the prison, known on the campus as the criminal ward. There was nothing of a prison atmosphere about the ward. No fences, no guard towers, no bars, no electronic gates or doors. It blended right in with the other large and stately buildings on the campus. It was, in fact, a completely open facility. I was checked in and escorted to my quarters, for I no longer looked on Swedish detention rooms as cells. My room in the ward was slightly smaller, but just as comfortable, and with similar furnishings and facilities to those of the one in which I'd been lodged at Clippan. The prison rules were relaxed, the restrictions lenient. I could wear my own clothes, and since I had only the one set, I was escorted to a clothing store in the city where I was outfitted with 2 changes of clothes. I was given unrestricted freedom to write and receive letters or other mail, and my mail was not censored. Since the ward housed only 100 prisoners, and it was not deemed economical to maintain a kitchen. Food was brought to prisoners from outside restaurants, and the prisoner prepared his own menu within reason. The ward was a co-ed prison. Several women were housed in the institution, but sexual cohabitation was prohibited between inmates. Conjugal visits were allowed between a man and wife, a wife and husband, or between an inmate and his/her boy-girl friend. The prisoners had the freedom of the building between 7 and 10 and they could receive visitors in their quarters between 4 and 10 The inmates were locked into their rooms at 10 curfew time in the ward. The ward housed no violent criminals. Its inmates were check swindlers, car thieves, embezzlers, and similar nonviolent criminals. However, prisoners were segregated in multi-roomed dormitories by age, sex, and type of crime. I was lodged in a dormitory with other forgers and counterfeiters of like age. Swedish prisons actually attempt to rehabilitate a criminal. I was told I could, during my term, either attend classes at the university or work in a parachute factory situated on the prison grounds, or I could simply serve my time in the ward. If I attended classes, the Swedish government would pay my tuition and furnish my supplies. If I chose to work in the parachute factory, I would be paid the prevailing free world wage for my job classification. Escape would have been easy, save for one factor. The Swedes at an early age are issued identity cards. They are rarely required to produce the card. But a policeman has a right to ask a citizen to display his or her identity card, and display of the ID is required for any border crossing or international train or plane journey. I didn't have one. I also didn't have any money. Serko also didn't have any money. It really didn't matter. Escape never entered my mind. I loved it at Malmo prison. One day, to my astonishment, one of my victims, a young bank clerk, appeared to visit me, bringing a basket of fresh fruit and some Swedish cheeses. I thought you might like to know that I did not get into any trouble because of your cashing checks at my station, said the young man. Also, I wanted you to know I have no ill feelings toward you. It must be very difficult to be imprisoned. I had really conned that kid. I had made him my friend, in fact, even visiting in his home. In order to perpetrate my swindle, his gesture really touched me. I both worked in the parachute factory and attended classes, which seemed to please the ward's supervisors. I studied commercial art, although I was more adept in some of the techniques taught at Lund than the instructors. The 6 months passed swiftly, too swiftly. During the 4th month, Mistress Christensen appeared with alarming news. The governments of Italy, Spain, Turkey, Germany, England, Switzerland, Greece, Denmark, Norway, Egypt, Lebanon, and Cyprus had all made formal requests to extradite me on completion of my sentence and had been accorded preference in that order. I would be handed over to Italian authorities on completion of my term, and Italy would determine which country would get me after I settled my debt with the Italians. One of my fellow inmates in the ward had served time in an Italian prison. The horror tales he recounted convinced me that Italian prisons were as bad as, if not worse than, Perpignan's jail. Christensen, too, had heard that conditions in Italian penal units were extremely harsh and brutal. She also had information that Italian judges and juries were not noted for leniency in criminal cases. We launched a determined campaign to prevent my extradition to Italy. I bombarded the judge who had presided at my trial, the Minister of Justice, and even the King himself with petitions and pleas for sanctuary, asking that I'd be allowed to stay in Sweden after my release, or at the worst that I be deported to my native United States. I pointed out that no matter where I went, if I was denied refuge in Sweden, I would be punished again and again for the same crime, and conceivably I could be shunted from prison to prison for the rest of my life. Each and every one of my pleadings was rejected. Extradition to Italy seemed inevitable. The night before Italian authorities were to take me into custody, I lay in my bed, unable to sleep and mulling over desperate plans for escape. I didn't feel I could survive any amount of imprisonment in Italy if penal conditions there were as terrible as I had been told, and I actually felt it would be better for me to be killed in an escape attempt than to die in a hellhole similar to Perpignan's. Shortly before midnight, a guard appeared. "Get dressed, Frank, and pack all your belongings," he instructed me. "There's some people here to get you." I sat up, alarmed. "What people?" I asked. "The Italians weren't supposed to pick me up before tomorrow," I was told. "They aren't," he replied. "These are Swedish officers." "Swedish officers?" I exclaimed. "What do they want?" He shook his head. "I don't know, but they have the proper papers to take you into custody." He escorted me out of the ward into a marked police car parked at the curb. A uniformed officer in the back seat opened the door and motioned for me to get in beside him. "The judge wants to see you," he said. They drove me to the judge's home, a modest dwelling in an attractive neighborhood, where I was admitted by the judge's wife. The officers remained outside. She led me to the judge's study and gestured toward a large leather chair. "Sit down, Mr. Abagnale," she said pleasantly. "I will bring you some tea, and the judge will be with you shortly." She spoke perfect English. The judge, when he appeared a few minutes later, was also fluent in English. He seated himself opposite me after greeting me, and then regarded me in silence for a few minutes. I said nothing, although I wanted to ask a dozen or more questions. Finally, the judge started speaking in a soft, deliberate manner. "Young man, I've had you on my mind for the past several days," he said. "I have, in fact, made many inquiries into your background and your case. You are a bright young man, Mr. Abagnale, and I think you could have made a worthwhile contribution to society, not only in your own country but elsewhere, had you chosen a different course. It is regrettable that you have made the mistakes that you have made." He paused. "Yes, sir," I said meekly, hopeful that I was here for more than a lecture. "We are both aware, young man, that if you are returned to Italy tomorrow, you might very well face a prison sentence of up to 20 years, the judge continued. "I have some knowledge of Italian prisons, Mr. They are very much like French prisons. And when you have served your sentence, you will be handed over to Spain, I understand. As you pointed out in your petition, young man, you could very well spend the rest of your life in European prisons. And there's very little we can do about that. Mister, we have to honor Italy's request for extradition, just as France honored ours. The law is not something we can flout with impunity, sir." He paused again. "I know, sir," I said, my hopes receding. "I would like to stay here, but I understand I cannot." He rose and began to pace around the study, talking the while. "What if you had a chance to start your life anew, mister? he asked. Do you think you would choose a constructive life this time? Yes, sir, if I had the chance, I replied. Do you think you've learned your lesson, as the teachers say? He pursued. Yes, sir, I really have, I said, my hopes rising again. He seated himself again and looked at me, finally nodding. I did something tonight, Mr. Abagnale, that surprised even myself, he said. Had someone told me 2 weeks ago that I would take this action, I would have questioned his sanity. Tonight, young man, I called a friend of mine in the American Embassy and made a request that violates your rights under Swedish law. I asked him to revoke your passport. Mr. and he did. I gazed at him, and from his slight grin I knew my astonishment was visible. I was really puzzled at his action, but not for long. You are now an unwelcome alien in Sweden, Mr. Abagnale, the judge said, smiling, and I can legally order your deportation to the United States, regardless of any extradition requests pending. In a few minutes, Mr. Abagnale, I'm going to order the officers outside to take you to the airport and place you on a plane for New York City. All the arrangements have been made. Of course, you should know that police of your own country will be waiting to arrest you when you debark from the aircraft. You are a wanted criminal in your own country too, sir, and I felt it only proper that they be notified of my actions. The FBI has been informed of your flight number and the time of your arrival. I'm sure you will be tried in your own country, but at least, young man, you will be among your own people, and I'm sure your family will be present to support you and to visit you in prison, if you are convicted. However, in case you aren't aware, once you have served your term in America, none of these other countries can extradite you. The law in the United States prohibits a foreign nation from extraditing you from the land of your birth. I have taken this action, young man, because I feel it is in the best interests of all concerned, especially yourself. I think, when you have settled your obligations in your own country, that you can have a fruitful and happy life. I am gambling my personal integrity on that, mister. I hope you don't prove me wrong. I wanted to hug and kiss him. Instead, I wrung his hand and tearfully promised him that I would make something worthwhile of my future. It was a promise I was to break within 18 hours. The officers drove me to the airport, where, to my delight, John was waiting to take charge of me. She had a large envelope containing my passport, my other papers, and the money I had earned in the prison parachute factory. She gave me a 20 bill I had and took a train to the Bronx. I didn't go home. I felt both my mother's apartment and my father's home would be under surveillance. But I did call Mom and then Dad. It was the first time in more than 5 years that I had heard their voices, and in each instance, both Mom and I and Dad and I ended up blubbering with tears. I resisted their entreaties to come to one of their homes and surrender myself to officers. Although I felt ashamed of myself for breaking my promise to the Malmo judge, I felt I'd had enough of prison life. Actually, I went to the Bronx to see a girl with whom I'd stashed some money and some clothing, one suit of which contained a set of keys to a Montreal bank safe deposit box. She was surprised to see me. "Good Lord, Frank," she exclaimed. "I thought you had disappeared for good. A few more days, and I was going to spend your money and give your clothes to the Salvation Army." I did not stop to dally. I wasn't sure how many of my girlfriends and acquaintances the FBI had been able to identify, or which ones, but I knew some had been ferreted out. I grabbed my clothes, gave her all but 20,000 stashed in a Montreal safe deposit box. It was my intention to pick up the money and take the soonest flight to Sao Paulo, Brazil, where I intended to go to Earth. You pick up some interesting information in prison. And in the ward I had learned that Brazil and the United States had no extradition treaty. Since I hadn't committed any crimes in Brazil, I felt I would be safe there and that Brazilian authorities would refuse extradition, even if I were caught in that country. I picked up the money. I never made the flight. I was waiting in line at the Montreal airport to purchase a ticket when someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned to face a tall, muscular man with pleasant features in the uniform of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. "Frank Abagnale, I am Constable James Hastings, and you are under arrest," said the Mountie with a friendly smile. The next day, I was driven to the New York-Canada border and handed over to the Border Patrol, who turned me over to FBI agents, who took me to New York City and lodged me in the federal detention facility there. I was arraigned before a commissioner who bound me over for trial under a 50 and make a couple of calls to friends you have in other banks to tell them what you think about my talk and what I'm doing. His first appearance as a white-collar crime specialist led to another appearance at a different bank, and then to another, and yet another. Within months, Abagnale was in widespread demand by banks, hotels, airlines, and other businesses. Today, 3 years later, Frank Abagnale is one of the nation's most popular crime authorities. With offices in both Houston and Denver, a highly trained staff, and gross revenues approaching $3 million. He still leads a life on the fly, constantly crisscrossing the nation to present seminars, give lectures, or to appear on various television panels. Frank Abagnale leads a very satisfying life. More importantly, he now realizes why he first embarked on a criminal voyage and why he is not now adrift on that dismal cruise. If I did not do what I do today, if I'd stayed a pizza cook, a grocery executive, or a movie projectionist, I might very well be back in prison today, Abagnale muses. Because there's no glamour, no excitement, no adventure, and nothing to fulfill my ego in those vocations. What I do today, on the other hand, fulfills all my needs. I get up in front of thousands of people, and I know they're listening to what I say. That's an ego trip. I appear on dozens of television programs annually. To me, that's a glamorous life. It's an adventuresome life, because I'm constantly being challenged by white-collar criminals who come up with new gimmicks to defraud clients. And I know they're out to put me down as much as they are to make a bundle. Actually, I haven't changed. All the needs that made me a criminal are still there. I have simply found a legal and socially acceptable way to fulfill those needs. I'm still a con artist. I'm just putting down a positive con these days, as opposed to the negative con I used in the past. I've simply redirected the talents I've always possessed. Today, if I walked into a crowded room and wanted to impress the people therein, I could impress them more by saying, "I'm Frank Abagnale, the imposter," than if I were to be the old Frank Abagnale, posing as a pilot, a doctor, or whatever. Frank Abagnale in reality is still a bumblebee personality, flying where he isn't supposed to fly at all, and making a pot of honey on the side. Table of contents: 1. The fledgling. 2. The pilot. 3. Fly a crooked sky. 4. If I'm a kid doctor, where's my jar of lollipops? 5. A law degree is just an illegal technicality. 6. Paper hanger in a Rolls-Royce. 7. How to tour Europe on a felony a day. 8. A small crew will do. It's just a paper airplane. 9. Does this tab include the tip? 10. Put out an APB. Frank Abagnale has escaped. Epilogue. Back cover photographs.